Theology.
Welcome to our Talking Theology segment, where we talk about theological topics. We are looking at the Ten Commandments, and this segment is part 3 and the final look at the 4th commandment. And what we're looking at this week is the Sabbath still required for Christians? Are we supposed to be practicing a weekly day where we don't do anything and we rest? Are we supposed to be doing that as Christians? Now, here's what the debate is in Scripture. Moses gave the 10 Commandments twice in Scripture. And the 4th commandment, which is dealing with the Sabbath, is the same in the book of Exodus and in the book of Deuteronomy. But he gave 2 different reasons for the Sabbath, or what I would call motivations for the Sabbath. In the book of Exodus, he said the 4th commandment was necessary because he just referenced that God rested from what he had created on the 7th day. And then in Deuteronomy, he gave a different motivation, and he said it was because God rescued the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. So the 4th commandment, if it's rooted in creation, then all Christians would have to follow it. However, if it's rooted in what we call the Mosaic covenant, and it's called the Mosaic covenant because the covenant was given to Moses, and it's rooted in the Mosaic covenant because God rescued the Israelites from slavery, then only Jews would have to observe the Sabbath because it is showing the other nations that the Jews followed Yahweh. And so that wouldn't deal with all Christians, it would only deal with the Jews. So there are Christians who believe in what I call the creation argument, like the Seventh-day Adventists. They practice the Sabbath on Saturday, just like the Jews do. And then there are the English Puritans, who also believed Christians should observe a Sabbath, but they moved it to Sunday because the early church did the same thing, because Jesus came out of the grave on a Sunday. And I would say many Christians fall into this camp, like the English Puritans, the early church, who observed a Sabbath, but it's moved to Sunday because the Sunday would be the Christian Sabbath, if I could say it like that. But then there is a third view, and it's based on the Reformers' tradition. Now, the Reformers' tradition comes from the Reformation that Martin Luther started, and this belief is that the Sabbath is a ceremonial law from the Old Testament. Therefore, it does not need to be observed. This view is where I lean, even though practicing the Sabbath, I think, is a very wise spiritual discipline that's good for your body, it's good for your soul to practice the Sabbath. I'm just saying it's not a commandment, all right? So why do I believe the Sabbath is a ceremonial law and it would fall under the Mosaic covenant? And the reason is because before the Mosaic covenant was given to Moses, there's no command given to anybody in the Bible to rest on the 7th day. We don't read anywhere before Moses on Mount Sinai were we told to rest on the 7th day. We're not told to rest on the 7th day, and we don't read of anybody resting on the 7th day before we get to Moses. In addition, Adam's and God's days would not have been the same. God's 7th day was Adam's 2nd day. And Genesis 2:1 and 3 states that God's creative acts were over, not that man or animals rested. Also, the 4th commandment motivation in Exodus refers to creation. We know that. However, that doesn't make it a creation order or a command. Also, the basis from Deuteronomy doesn't apply to Christians because they were not freed from bondage. Therefore, the covenantal sign of Egypt, of the Israelites being freed from bondage from Egypt, does not apply to us Christians. Here's an interesting factoid. The fourth commandment is the only one of the 10 commandments that's not repeated in the New Testament after the crucifixion of Jesus. The other 9 commandments are all mentioned at least 4 times each. But there's nothing said about the Sabbath. Jesus loved using the Sabbath to teach others. Jesus upset people because of what he did on the Sabbath. His views on the Sabbath eventually led to his crucifixion. And people just got mad at Jesus all the time because of what he did on Sabbaths. For example, it seems like Jesus deliberately healed on the Sabbath when he could have waited until the next day. He was just doing that just to incite these Pharisees and people who thought they knew things that they didn't know. There's other incidents like the disciples gathering food on the Sabbath as they walked through a field. We saw in Mark 2. Jesus, however, pointed the Pharisees to David's example, implying that hunger and human needs superseded any religious rules on the Sabbath. To make matters worse, when he was confronted, he said the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of the people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. And he said that in Mark chapter 2. The Jews hated Jesus' attitude because they revered the Sabbath. And as stated before, the fourth commandment is not repeated in the New Testament any time after the crucifixion and the church started. In Paul's letters, he clarified that the Sabbath is not binding upon Christians. Instead, Paul calls the Sabbath a shadow in Colossians chapter 2. And the writer of Hebrews does the same in Hebrews chapter 10. Therefore, Paul categorizes the Sabbath with food laws and festivals like the Passover, and he minimizes their importance. In Romans 14:5, Paul says that whatever days you considered holy is not even essential. Therefore, I believe the Sabbath observance is no longer binding on Christians. This view was the Reformers' belief. And I also want to take you to the Jerusalem Council's decision in Acts 15, because they didn't put the Sabbath requirement on Gentiles who are now becoming Christians, even though they even mentioned the Sabbath in their ruling. So in detail, I believe the Sabbath started at Mount Sinai as a practice for Jews. However, God's example of creation gives us a good practice for us to follow, even though it's not mandatory. Practicing the Sabbath keeps us balanced. It keeps us rested. We should engage in activities that restore and replenish us on any day that we choose to be our Sabbath. So practicing a Sabbath day, whether it's Saturday, Sunday, or any other day, will help you enjoy life better and help you be ready to face what God brings you on your journey with Him, even though it's not mandatory. Please remember that theology is the study of God, and the more we understand about God, the more we know about ourselves, because we were created in His image. I look forward to talking to you in future Talking Theology segments.
We're talking theology.